Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this video we're going to be discussing challenges, conflicts and contests within Fate. Normally Fate has a fairly loose method of rolling to triumph over opposition or complete a task. You basically make a simple overcome roll against a difficulty either set by the GM, or you pitch your roll against an NPC's roll. But there are, however, occasions when you want to make more of a big deal about the process of trying to complete a task, whether it be the tension of diffusing the complex and baroque death trap of a James Bond-esque villain, or perhaps the back and forth of a frenzied combat. Now, when you do want to zoom in on the action, Fate has you covered, providing three methods you can use. These are challenges, used when one or more characters are attempting to achieve something dynamic or complicated. Contests, when two or more characters are competing for a goal, but they're not actively and actually trying to harm each other. And 3, conflicts, when two or more parties are actually trying to harm each other directly. So first of all, let's look at challenges. Now, an overcome roll is often more than adequate for resolving actions where the details of how something gets done and the time it takes are not important in the grand scheme of things. However, if the action is a little more complicated, is time sensitive, or perhaps there are serious consequences for failure, then you may wish to consider using a challenge. A challenge is basically a series of overcome rolls that must be passed to complete a complicated task. Each action uses a different skill to deal with resolving one part of the overall task. The number of successes and failures are then added up to determine the overall success or failure of the task. So when should you use a challenge? Well, there are two questions you should ask yourself when deciding whether or not to use a challenge. 1, will splitting the task into a series of roles generate additional tension and drama? And 2, does the situation require different skills to deal with? If the task can be resolved using a single simple roll, or splitting it up isn't going to generate any additional tension, then you may as well just use a normal overcome roll. So how do you run a challenge? Well, first of all, decide what actions are required for the task, have the players make each overcome roll in whatever order seems appropriate, but don't announce the failure or success of the task until you have the results of all the rolls. Once all the rolls have been made, the GM will then look at the number of successes and failures and use them to narrate how the event unfolds. So now we come to contests, and if characters have opposing goals but they aren't trying to harm each other directly, then they're involved in a contest. For example, a race, a quiz, or a public debate might be examples. How to run a contest? First of all, identify the sides in a conflict. If it's every man for himself, then you can continue as normal. Whereas if there are teams competing, then you can use the teamwork rules that I'll talk about at the end of this video to make a single roll for each team. Secondly, identify any environmental factors that may affect the contest and how exactly the participants in the contest are opposing each other. Having these factors clearly in mind at the start will make it easier to narrate the outcome later on. 3, work out what skills are appropriate to use in the contest. Does everyone have to use the same skill, or are multiple skills applicable? For example, if we're running a contest and it's a game of poker, say, then the players may be using the deceive skill as a standard role to represent bluffing, etc. But perhaps if someone's trying to palm a card or something similar, then stealth may also be applicable. And next, once you've identified the above factors, the contest proceeds in a series of exchanges. In essence, each side makes an overcome roll and compares the result. The person with the highest result in that exchange wins the exchange and scores a victory mark. You can jot this down on an index card or something similar. They also get to describe how they are taking the lead in the contest. So the poker player might describe pulling out a royal flush or something to win that hand. If a person succeeds with style and no one else does, then they gain 2 victory marks. If there is a tie, then no one gets a victory and an unexpected twist, which will be narrated by the GM, occurs. So perhaps in our poker game, if they've all rolled a tie, they're just about to lay down their cards when the saloon door is booted open and a group of outlaws burst in, fleeing from the local law enforcement, having just robbed a bank, and disrupt the occurrences inside the saloon. The contest ends when a person achieves 3 victories, and they are then the winner of the contest. You can also try to create an advantage in a contest before making your normal roll, using the normal rules for creating an advantage. If you fail, though, you do forfeit your contest roll for that exchange, so there is a little bit of a risk. A variant of this system is used to resolve one-on-one duels in Reroll Productions' Jadepunk game, with the addition that a duelist can lower his opponent's margin of success by taking consequences. This is a great way of representing the fast and action-packed duel in a way that is quick, but has a very different feel to the standard conflict method of resolving conflict. And if you're going to be running a game that involves a lot of one-on-one fighting and honour duels, then I suggest you give it a look. Next we move on to conflicts. So when should you use a conflict? Well, when characters are actually actively trying to harm one another, whether this be a physical fight, psychic attacks, or a particular witty and cutting diatribe. If the characters involved have the intent and the ability to harm each other, then you should be using the conflict rules. So how do you run a conflict? First of all, describe the scene and the environment that the conflict is taking place in. Consider turning anything in the scenery that may affect the conflict, whether that be lighting conditions, loose footing, etc., into an aspect. And make sure to have these in plain view so that everyone knows they can be used during the conflict. If your conflict takes place in a large area, you may want to split it into a number of zones. And a zone is just an abstract way of representing physical space. A person can easily talk to or physically interact with someone in the same zone, whereas they'll need a ranged weapon or some other device to interact with someone outside their zone, and even then, normally only in the adjoining zones, unless they have a very long range on their rifle or whatever it is. Player characters can normally move one zone a turn. Anyone wanting to move further can make an overcome roll versus the number of zones moved through as the difficulty level on an appropriate skill. In standard Fate Core, athletics would be appropriate. Secondly, determine the turn order. Now, turn order is based on the levels of relevant skills. Generally, in Fate Core, this is notice for a physical conflict and empathy for a mental conflict. However, as the highest skill ranking goes first, followed by the next highest, and so on and so forth. If there's a tie, then you compare secondary and or tertiary skills. The secondary skills are athletics for physical and rapport for mental, and the tertiary skills are physique for physical and will for mental. Once you've done that, point number 3, start the first exchange. So on your turn, you take an action and then resolve it. This is normally an attack or a create advantage of some kind. However, a character may voluntarily give up their action to carry out what is called a full defense action, basically meaning they're forsaking any other actions and doing anything else to concentrate entirely on defense. They may do nothing else in that exchange, but they do gain a +2 bonus to all defense rolls. On other people's turns, you defend or respond to their actions as appropriate, and at the end of everyone's turn, a new exchange begins. When everyone in a conflict has conceded or been taken out, then the conflict is over. So how do you resolve attacks? Well, a successful attack lands a hit equivalent to the shift value of the roll on the target. So for instance, if your attack roll is 3 shifts higher than your opponent's defense roll, you've done a 3-shift attack. When you are hit by an attack, you can either absorb the hit and remain active, or you're taken out. To absorb an attack, you can take stress or consequences. You can also concede a conflict before being taken out. This means that you forfeit the conflict, but you retain more say over what happens to your character as a result. So let's move on to a brief discussion of stress. Stress boxes represent glancing hits or narrowly avoided blows that throw a PC off their game or can slow them down, but rarely actually do much long-term damage. Each stress box on a character sheet has a numerical value next to it, and this number is the number of stress that particular box can absorb. However, you can only tick one stress box per hit. For instance, if you take a 2 shift hit, then you could tick your 2 stress box to absorb it completely. If, however, you'd already used your 2 stress box, then you could tick your 1 stress box to absorb one of the shifts, but you would need to take the rest as a consequence, or you would be taken out of the fight. Since stress is minor and it represents small injuries and glancing blows, after a conflict is finished, a character recovers all of their stress. So let's move on to the more serious business of consequences. And these are the second option for absorbing shifts from a successful hit. These represent more severe and lasting injuries. Character sheets contain mild, moderate and severe consequence spaces, each of them absorbing 2, 4 and 6 hits of damage respectively. When a consequence is used to absorb shifts, you must write a description or a name for the injury in the consequence box in question. This consequence becomes an aspect that can be used against the PC, at least until the injury heals. The person who inflicts the consequence also receives a free invoke of it. So you can represent those sort of situations where if a villain shoots one of the PCs in the leg or vice versa, in the next round he may invoke the aspect, the consequence of broken leg, as he stamps on their already injured leg to gain an advantage in the conflict. In terms of recovering, the player must succeed in an overcome action using a relevant skill, with the difficulty equaling the shift value of the consequence in question, and then an appropriate amount of time must pass. So for instance, if you've taken a mild consequence, you would have to make a difficulty 2 roll, and after that, mild consequences take a scene after the recovery action, moderate consequences take a whole session after the recovery action to heal, and the severe consequences take 1 scenario, generally about 3 sessions, after the recovery action to heal. Once they've healed, you can rub out the name of the injury and you are no longer affected by it. In addition to the consequences we've just mentioned, a player character has one last ditch option to stay in the fight. They may take an extreme, which is an 8 shift consequence. Instead of writing the name of a consequence in an appropriate box, the extreme consequence actually replaces one of your aspects, excluding the high concept. It is so serious it literally changes who your character is. An extreme consequence cannot be healed in the normal manner. You're stuck with it until you reach your next major milestone. So we mentioned earlier that you can also concede a conflict. Now, if things are looking dicey in a conflict, or you decide that it's not worth the potential loss, you can interrupt any action at any time before the dice are rolled to declare you are conceding the conflict. Concession is you effectively allowing your opponents to win and achieve their aims. However, you do gain some benefits from it. You gain a fate point for choosing to concede, plus an additional fate point for each consequence you sustain during the conflict. You also get to avoid the worst outcome. You've lost the conflict, don't get me wrong, nothing can change that, and nor can you try and wriggle out of that or overthrow your enemy's triumph. However, something like your character being mistakenly left for dead when he was just knocked out, or being taken captive instead of killed, is certainly possible. And speaking of getting taken out, if you have taken damage and you have no stress or consequences to absorb the shifts of a hit, then you have been taken out. You can't fight anymore and your opponent gets to decide how you are taken out. Whether this is death or some other avenue is entirely up to them. So now, as we mentioned earlier, we're going to move on to look at the teamwork rules. Now, in Fate, characters can help each other or aid each other with various actions. And there are 2 different ways of using this offered in Fate Core. The first is combining skills, which is when your characters are all pushing together, putting effort into an action. Like, for instance, if you were both using physique to push open a stuck door or something like that. Or the second method is stacking advantages for when the group is setting a single person up to do well. So for instance, you might have a number of your players causing distractions, enabling the person they're setting up to slip past the palace guards unnoticed. So let's look at combining skills first. Now when you combine skills, you take the person who has the highest ranking in the relevant skill, and for each other person who has at least an average or a +1 rating in that skill, they add +1 to the highest person's level. So if the highest person had a skill rating of +3 and there were 2 other people with average abilities helping them, that would take them up to a +5 skill in total. If you fail to roll when you're combining skills, however, everyone who is involved in that skill roll takes whatever consequences occur as a result of that failure. So there is an additional risk for helping other people out. However, you do boost their skill beyond what might be their normal level and give them a greater chance of success. When you stack your advantages, each person creates an advantage using the normal rules, and they just give whatever free invocations they have to a single character. And don't forget that multiple invocations from the same aspect can stack because they were earned at different points in time, but they can be applied to the same role. So that's how teamworking functions in Fate Core, and this has been our video looking at challenges, conflicts and contests. I hope you've found it useful, and that if you've enjoyed it, you'll click on the red dice up there to subscribe to my channel. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down. As always, if you have any comments or suggestions, put them in the comments box below, especially if you have any suggestions for things you'd like to see in future Matters of Fate videos. I love reading what you write. Until I see you next time, take care wherever you are in the world, and happy gaming.